All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Ferraro, and I'm joined by my colleague Jelly. We're with the Google Premier partner Dido, and we are just going to spend a few minutes kind of going through Google Maps platform optimizations. And so, really, what we're mean by optimizations in this specific case is cost optimization. So how can you build really compelling apps that incorporate various Google Maps functionality at the lowest cost possible, being cognizant of some of those cost considerations, as well as avoiding some of the common pitfalls that we see with our customers and situations where they end up spending more than they need to on their application. So we're not really going to be delving into things like performance optimizations, how to render a whole bunch of objects on the map more quickly or anything like that. We're really talking about cost optimization on this webinar today. But before we kind of get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to take a second to introduce who is Dido for anyone who's not familiar with us. So we're really a full stack Google Cloud Premier partner. And what that means is we're a Premier partner across really the full range of Google Enterprise services. So that incorporates G Suite, Google Cloud Platform, Chrome Enterprise, Jamboards, as well as, of course, Google Maps, which we're focusing on today. And so what that means is, of course, we provide licensing for these various services, as well as additional services on top of that. So that could be everything from basic support and training to various managed services, cloud consulting, custom development, etc. And we've been involved in the Google ecosystem for over 10 years now. Dido was one of the original hand-picked Google partners for G Suite when they were starting their partner ecosystem. And over the years, as Google has grown their enterprise offerings, we've grown alongside them. And today we support almost 1,500 customers across these different product lines that really incorporate a wide variety of use cases and deployments. Shelly, I'll pass it over to you to kind of start off with the real part of the presentation here.
All right, great. So you guys are using Google Maps or thinking about using Google Maps. A lot of our optimization plan kind of hinges on these four big questions here, these four main ideas that we kind of ask along the process, along the way to figure out, where can we optimize. So the first thing is, what are you trying to do with Google Maps? We want to understand your use case. What services are you using? What is on your invoice now? Are you following best practices? This is a big one, and we're going to be pointing out some common mistakes in our presentation that sometimes lead to unnecessary spending. So we'll definitely cover those. Things we're looking for are the APIs implemented properly. Is the API that you've chosen the best one for the task that you're trying to accomplish? And then finally, is it possible to get the same or a similar value from a different API for less cost? So what are you trying to accomplish? This is basically, how are you using Google Maps, or why are you using Google Maps? What value does it give to your business? Does it improve the user experience? Is accuracy of information important to you? Are you tracking assets in real time? Do you need real-time traffic data? Do your users depend on the data or the maps to, accomplish their jobs or do their tasks? The answers to these questions help us best understand your use case so we can work together towards optimization for you.
And, really one of the most first and basic questions that someone asks themselves when they're looking to build an application that incorporates Google Maps is, what mapping options do I have available to me? And what's the best option for my specific situation? And a lot of that is going to be determined by the use case requirements that Jelly just went through. And so, oftentimes there may be a couple different options that will suit your needs just fine. So really understanding the different functionality of the various map visualization options, what sort of, how they're typically used, and the pricing is important to understand, so that as you're making that decision, you understand, what is the best matching option at the right cost for your given use case. And so I'm just going to spend a few minutes walking through what are some of those different map visualization options at your disposal. And to start off with, I'm going to talk about dynamic maps and Street View. And this is probably what people typically think of when they think of Google Maps. And so what dynamic maps are, it's an interactive map interface. So you can interact with the map in various sorts of ways. You can pan in and out of the map or pan around the map. You can zoom in and out. You can also optionally overlay various information on the map, like markers or various sorts of shapes and polygons, or some additional customized overlays. So maybe that's where your vehicles have traveled, or where they're currently located, or maybe it's simply where your stores are located, and be able to display those on a map. And so it really provides a rich ability to customize the map and allow your user to interact and have that map respond to those interactions. So maybe you're displaying the list of your store locations, right? And as the user scrolls over those in a list view, you want to highlight the marker for the location they're showing, or vice versa. So it provides the most functionality of all the mapping options, but it also comes at the highest cost. So one thing we always work with on our customers as they're looking to implement something using dynamic maps is it's typically something that is going to be a fairly centralized component of the user interface. And you typically only want to be using one dynamic map on a page at a time. And that's simply because usually a user's attention is only drawn to one map, and they're only interacting with one map at a given time. And yeah, so you can obviously have the map respond to user input in various sorts of ways. So you can change the map size, you can update the information being displayed on the map, all within the same map interface without incurring additional charges from loading additional maps. So really for dynamic maps, where the charge is incurred is on the initialization of a new map object. So you create a map object and you set some initial parameters. Where do you want the map centered? What's the zoom level? Any initial markers, for example, you want displayed on the map. But then you can update that information for that same map object, so you can recenter the map. You can remove the information that's displayed and display new information, or as I mentioned, even change the size of the map, all while updating the same map object. So you only incur one charge. And so if it's done intelligently, even though it is the most expensive option, you can build really compelling applications without it being a huge cost driver for that application. The second option is static maps, and as the name says, those maps are static. So they provide a lot of the same options as dynamic maps. You can overlay markers, you can customize the styling of the map, but it doesn't provide the ability for the user to interact with the map interface in any way. But oftentimes that's okay. Maybe one area where we see these used quite a bit is maybe you've gone through the store locator and you've identified the specific location you want to visit, and it brings up that individual location page. Well, oftentimes there's a map displayed there, but really what the user is typically trying to do is just get a general sense of where that location is, but the rate of interaction is very low. And so if you're looking but the advantage of static maps is that come at a much lower cost than dynamic maps. And if you run into a situation where typically users aren't interacting with it, but you're trying to solve for some sort of edge case, you can do that where you can have that static map be converted on the fly into a dynamic map, or you can have a dynamic map window pop up. So just because you begin with a static map doesn't mean you're necessarily restricted to that. There are options at that point to, again, responding to kind of user input, right? And again, the big advantage of static maps is they do come at a much lower cost than dynamic maps, and they are very easy to implement. So really all you're doing is sending an HTTP request with any parameters you want for that map included in that request, and then it just returns an image in a specified file format. The third option is the Maps Embed API. And this is the lowest cost option, but it does come with some pretty severe limitations. So the ability to customize the map is very minimalized. So you can, the user interface is kind of take it or leave it. There's not really any customization options there, and you can only overlay a single marker. Additionally, there will be ads that appear on the map, and those ads may change over time. So again, if you're showing the location of your businesses, it is quite possible that the location of your competitor businesses will be included on the map as well. And so you might want to think long and hard about whether the embed option is the right option for you, but there are some advantages. So if you're just looking to integrate a very simple mapping window and some of those limitations don't apply to your specific situation, it is very easy to implement. So you embed a embed map by a simple HTTP request where, again, the parameters are included in that URL. And if you're working with something like a blog or a website that doesn't support scripting, it is a good option for those sort of scenarios as well. The final option is Android and iOS, using the Android and iOS mobile SDKs to integrate a map into a native mobile application. And these provide a lot of the same functionality as dynamic maps with a couple minor exceptions, but what they're optimized for is performance on mobile devices. So dealing with what's typically lesser compute and memory resources, for example, the varying form factor of those devices, and how users typically interact with the map through gestures rather than a mouse, of course. And in the case of the maps themselves, they are 100% free to use. So again, if you're building a mobile native application, Android and iOS, using the Android and iOS mobile SDKs is typically going to be the best option. Now, if you do anything else through the SDKs, if you're using mobile places, for example, or the Geocoding API, or any of those other map services, those will be charged, the same way as if it was done through the JavaScript API or the web services. So it's really only kind of the map visualization portion of things that's free. But again, for mobile native applications, it is a very good option. So that kind of goes through some of the different map visualization options that are available, when to use one or the other and the price considerations there. So now I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the different routing options. So the directions and distance matrix APIs. And one thing that kind of gets confusing here is the same call to the same API can result in a different cost depending on what parameters are included in that request. So there's really a basic tier and an advanced tier. And there's three things that can be included in a request where if they are, that request will be classified as an advanced tier. So the first one is including traffic information in that request. So that could be current traffic conditions. Do you want to know the route and the drive time and the drive distance based on the road network with current traffic conditions included? Or are you leveraging Google's predictive travel time feature where essentially you're able to set a departure time at some point in the future, and then Google uses their historic traffic modeling to anticipate what the traffic conditions will be at that future point and how that's going to impact the route and the travel time. So if you incorporate that sort of traffic information to a request, it will be classified as advanced, and advanced requests come at twice the cost as basic requests. So there is a meaningful difference in the cost depending on whether you're including these options. The second one is if you're including more than 10 waypoints in a request. So when you make a directions request, you include an origin and a destination, but you can also optionally include a set of up to 25 waypoints. If you're including 10 or less, with the caveat I'll get to in a second, it is considered a basic request. If you're including 11 or more waypoints, then that will be considered an advanced request as well. The final thing that will classify something as an advanced request is if you're doing waypoint optimization. So you can tell the service, I want to stop at this place first, followed by this place next, and so on down the line. Or you can tell the service, maybe I have these 5 locations I want to visit. I don't particularly care of the order. Just tell me the fastest way to visit all the locations. You know, it's kind of that classic travel and salesperson problem it's solving for. And so if you're using waypoint optimization, regardless of the number of waypoints included in the request, it will be classified as advanced request as well. And then I guess the final thing worth pointing out as it relates to the directions API and distance matrix is they are built a little bit differently from a request perspective as well. So the directions API is just considered, each time you make a request to the directions API, it is considered one request from a billing perspective. So that's pretty straightforward. But the distance matrix works a little different. So the distance matrix is instead built based off of the number of elements returned in the response from that request, where the number of elements is determined by taking the number of origins and multiplying it by the number of destinations. So if you have, maybe you're trying to calculate the drive time and the drive distance to the 5 closest stores as the bird flies for a given user. Well, that would be, one origin, the user's location, and 5 destinations, the locations of those 5 closest stores. And so from a distance matrix billing perspective, that would be considered 5 elements. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and one thing we always make sure our customers understand. And so really reducing the dimensionality of that matrix is important to help control costs. So, how do we pre-filter so we only include locations in that distance matrix request that we need to? All right, so moving on to address autocomplete, and this is where we see probably the most confusion and the most waste in terms of the most wasted costs for Google Maps. And there's really a couple reasons why. The first is that to implement autocomplete, it actually relies on a couple different APIs. And the second is that there is a couple ways that you can be billed for it. And so there's per request billing and per session billing. And really kind of skipping to the Cliff Notes portion of it, the per session billing is really always going to be the better option. And the reason why is for per request autocomplete billing, each time the user enters in a character and it updates those lists of address suggestions, there is a charge associated with that. And then there's an additional charge when the user actually selects a location from those suggestions and it retrieves the full details about that location. So when the user selects a location, it executes a places details request. And that's what returns things like the formatted address and address components, the lat long, and a bunch of other information about that location. So you get charged for the updated suggestions, and then you get additional charge when the user selects a location. If you contrast that with per session billing, all that is just rolled into a single charge. And the cost of the per session, the cost of a session is actually the same cost as that places details request when the user makes a selection. So you essentially get all that user interaction where they're entering in a location and it's updating the list of suggestions as they type for free. And so that's really why per session billing is really always going to be the better option there. But there is a couple things to keep in mind there. So if you're using what we call the autocomplete widget, sessions are managed for you automatically. There's nothing that needs to be done from a development perspective to manage those sessions. But if you're using another class under the JavaScript API or the web service, there's a number of ways you can implement all these different Google Maps services. So if you're using anything outside of the autocomplete widget, then it doesn't fall on the developer to be able to implement and manage those sessions. And basically what that requires is generating a session token and then passing that as part of each request to update the list of address suggestions, as well as that places details request when the user selects an address. And a couple of the things we see is to keep in mind is sometimes they will reuse that session token, and if that occurs, that will get flagged and that will instead be charged on a per request basis. So you always want to make sure to generate a new session token for each autocomplete session. The second thing is making sure that that session token is being passed as part of through the entire process. So sometimes they'll pass the session token for the address suggestion updates, but it will not be passed for the places details request. And when that happens, there's no way to tie that places details request back to that session. So you're essentially charged twice, once for the session and once for the places details request. Another thing to keep in mind as it relates to autocomplete is when that places details request is made, by default, it returns all the information about that specific location. But really, that's divided into 3 data categories of basic, contact, and atmosphere. And only the basic data is included in the cost of that autocomplete session. And the reason why that's the case is really for kind of legacy reasons. There was always the option to specify just the data you needed returned by places details. However, under the previous billing model, that didn't impact the cost. So really, no one did. And so when Google changed their licensing to now start charging for that additional data, everyone basically needed to go back, update their code so that only the data they needed returned where it was actually being returned. And that's something that we still see a lot of people have not done. So I really can't think of an example. Anything outside the basic data was used for autocomplete use cases. So that includes things like the formatted address, address components, and lat long. Typically, everything you would typically need for an autocomplete sort of scenario. But without, again, specifying those fields, that contact and atmosphere data will be returned, and you will be charged additionally for that. So that's something that's very important, is to make sure you're specifying those fields so you're not being charged for any additional data that you're not actually using. The next API I want to cover is the Geocoding API. And this has the advantage of being a much lower cost than address autocomplete. However, it does require you to have a full, well-formatted address to send to the request. And it doesn't work very well with ambiguous addresses. But if you have a well-formatted, complete, unambiguous address, the Geocoding API is a very good option because of its lower costs. Additionally, if you have a scenario where maybe only the user typically only enters a zip code, because they're just talking about entering in 5 numbers, autocomplete doesn't provide a lot of additional value there. So that's a good scenario, again, for maybe when the Geocoding API makes more sense than the Places API. But regardless, one thing we want to make sure is that you're avoiding unnecessary geocodes. So we see this happen in kind of a few different ways. One is kind of just a product of the development environment and a group of developers working together on an application. So maybe you need the lat long for a location for one part of the user experience, and then you need the lat long for that same location for another part of the user experience. And rather than just passing the lat long, oftentimes we'll see the address is passed instead, and then make another request to the Geocoding API instead of using the lat long they already have. That's an unnecessary call to the Geocoding API, and that's driving some unnecessary costs. So reusing the lat long when you already have it is definitely a good idea rather than making unnecessary geocoding requests. The other thing is, while most data returned from the Google Maps services can't be stored for any real period of time, the Google API is an exception to that. So you can store the results of a geocoding request for up to 30 days. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're geocoding the same address string multiple times within that 30-day period, it may be worthwhile looking at some sort of caching option. And that's something that we can work through with you. What is the best caching option for your specific situation while staying in line with Google's terms of service? And there's a lot of other things we see that people do that from an optimization perspective. So we've really just tried to kind of focus on the main ones here that we see most frequently. But the last one I wanted to touch on was avoiding making requests on page load whenever possible, and instead send user interaction requests on demand. So basically what this means is don't make a request until you actually need the data. So if you are, rather than loading a map on page load where maybe it's not providing any value to the user, wait until, let's say, the user enters in an address and you can center that map and actually provide some valuable information to the user. Another example is don't start an autocomplete session on page load. Start an autocomplete session when the user actually types in or clicks into that text field and starts typing in a location. So we see a lot of times where requests are made before that data or information or map actually needs to be used. And that's just making unnecessary requests before they're needed, and that can drive up the cost unnecessarily of the application as well. All right, Kelly, I'll pass it back to you to cover some of the best practices in console reports section.
All right. So as you can see, there's a variety of gotchas and pitfalls that you can get into while using Google Maps, just because there's all the different ways to use the APIs and just the different ways that they can be charged. So how do we know what you're being charged for, and how do we relate that back to how you use the APIs or how you plan to use the APIs? And the answer is just hop on over to the Google Cloud Console, go to the billing section and then the reports tab, and that's where you'll find your billing report and a bunch of filter options that will show you that information. Because the billing report is really just, it's a source of truth. It's what Google sees on their end. It's what Google is charging you for and what they're seeing of how you're using the APIs. And so to get that line item breakdown, to get the individual services that you're being charged for, you'll want to use this SKU level filter, and that's going to break it down into all the APIs you're using and the usage counts for each. And the goal here, when you're looking at your billing report always, is to make sure that each and every line item here corresponds with something in your use case. We want to know that all your usage is explained by some kind of intended action. And just another option for looking at your usage report is it's in that same section, the billing section, right underneath the reports is a cost table. It's pretty much the same information, it's just in a different format. Some people like that format better, so just wanted to point that out as well. So thinking back to those 4 big questions that we had in the beginning, and also thinking about your use case, I think we can all kind of look at these billing reports with a more critical eye now. So when you're looking at your line items, types of questions you want to ask yourself, like with the autocomplete in places, are you using sessions? Do the number of requests line up with the number of expected users that you have? With geocoding, can you cache any of those? Does the number correspond with the number of transactions that you have? Same thing with dynamic maps. With routes, do you actually need the road network distance, or is a simple straight line distance good enough? Do you need real-time traffic data for those advanced requests? Places details, do you actually need all the extra details, or do you need to confine your request to only return the basic details? And with mobile maps, since they're free, are you taking advantage of those? So just some best practices. We like to cover these just because it's kind of part of being optimized. I think, part of that is having control and being organized. So starting with billing best practices, getting a handle of where your spending is coming from, that's really going to be a big step in cutting out any unnecessary spending should it occur. First thing is you want to make sure that you have access to your billing account. Billing account and project permissions are generally separated, so you'll want to make sure that the appropriate people have access to the billing account, such as people that need to get in there and view expenses and monitor that. You want to only grant permission to the certain people that you want to have the ability to link projects to your billing account. So you definitely want to be careful when prescribing those permissions. The next thing is setting budgets. Oh, sorry. You want to make sure that you set budgets and alerts. These are highly recommended. You can set them on a monthly target, and you get to choose your threshold. So it's custom thresholds there for alerting. And you can set your budgets on project scope, the product, or on the whole billing account. And you can have multiple budgets too. So you can set individual budgets for each project and have one for your overall account. For example, it's all customizable for you and your use case. There is an export of billing data available to BigQuery. This is optional, but we definitely recommend this as well. And what this does is it sends a detailed record of your billable activity to BigQuery. I would say this is a must-have for those of you who are using labels or using like your organization's folders to organize expenses internally, because the billing export is the only place where you can view that information. Now, while quotas are not a part of the billing section, it can help you save money. It's just another way that you can manage expenses. Quotas will put a hard cap on your usage per API, so some people don't really like that, but it is an option available to you if you need those hard limits to restrict your spending. And then last but not least, I think I mentioned it already, but monitoring. We want you to log in and check your usage and check your billing reports regularly. Make it a habit, just because this can save you in situations where usage spikes or somebody leaves something on right before Christmas break and you're stuck with the charges because of that action. So we want to encourage you, don't wait until invoice time. Don't wait for things to surprise you then. You want to log in and monitor that. So some more best practices around API keys. The first and foremost, use restrictions. The default configuration for API keys is unrestricted. So what that means is that they're wide open. Anybody can use that anywhere they want. So we want you to make sure that you secure your keys to prevent usage theft. Use separate keys for different applications, or if you need further separation, just go ahead and create separate projects and create your keys under those separate projects. And the reason for that is so you can better isolate where usage is coming from on your reports, and especially in the billing section if you are using separate projects. It's really easy to tell where usage is coming from if you have it on separate projects. So if there's some kind of runaway process or something that needs troubleshooting, it's a little bit easier to figure out where that's coming from if you have it all separated. You'll want to make sure that you clean up any old keys, especially old unrestricted testing keys, for example. You want to make sure that you get rid of those if you're not using them, just so that you don't get on the hook for some unnecessary expenses should somebody decide to use that. And again, monitor usage. For APIs or API in services section, not in the billing section, you can monitor near real-time usage in that APIs and services dashboard area of the console. This can be helpful if you are pushing changes or changing something in your code and you want to verify response. For example, if you're doing something and you're expecting like your geocodes to drop by 50%, you don't have to wait until your next invoice to figure that out. You can look in that APIs and services dashboard and get usage as recent as 1 hour and as far back as 30 days. It's kind of a different way that you can monitor your usage there. So on to project best practices. You want to make sure that your IAM policies are kept updated. You want to add and remove users as needed and assign appropriate roles. Don't be the only person that has access to your project. This can be a problem if people need to log in and restrict those API keys, for example. You want to make sure that you add a backup person. Don't use personal accounts to manage your Google Cloud projects for work. There's just a lot of problems with doing that. We recommend that you use your G Suite Google account or your individual Google account to manage those projects. I mentioned separating projects or separating, into different projects to help isolate cost and things like that, but also, a purpose of separating keys into different projects is to help limit scope. So either between individuals or between teams, since you can control the permissions to projects separately, if you need to grant somebody viewer access to a project, they can view all the API keys. So if you need to kind of limit what developers can see or just individuals within your teams, use separate projects and use those policies to kind of restrict access there. And again, monitor usage. I know I've said it enough times already, but I can't emphasize the importance of that more, just because if you aren't paying attention, then you could get stuck with some expenses that you weren't expecting. And you can do that in a number of ways. Obviously, logging in manually and going to the billing or the APIs and services dashboard is one way to do it, but there is also advanced monitoring available via Stackdriver, or now called cloud monitoring. This is relatively new. In a couple years ago, you really couldn't do this, but now since Google Maps platform is really kind of part of the Google Cloud platform, you can now take advantage of these tools, such as Stackdriver, to monitor your maps usage. Now, what this does is it allows you to set customizable alert policies based on usage. And there's multiple notification channels, not just email. You can alert through the console app, the Google Cloud Console app, text, or even connect to PubSub. And you can get really fancy with these alerting policies. You can set them on single or multi-project workspaces. And there's tons of metrics that you can monitor in addition to maps. So this is something our team can definitely help with if you're interested.
All right, so if anyone has any questions, we're nearing the end of the webinar here. Please feel free to put them in the chat. But before we wrap up, I want to just go through real quick, what does it mean to partner with Dida for Google Maps or any of the other Google Enterprise services that we support? And really, we are a value-add Google partner, so we provide some additional benefits. And the good news for the customer is that oftentimes those come at no additional cost. And the reason we're able to do this is essentially Google pays us to partner with you and make sure you are getting the most out of their products and services. So you're happy utilizing them and continue to be their customer for the long run. So one thing we're always happy to do with all of our customers is just walk through your use case with you and the architecture you're using, making sure that it makes sense and that really best practices are being followed, and just help you point you in the right direction so you avoid some common pitfalls and build the best application incorporating Google Maps that you can. The second is project billing setup and assistance and training on that. So it's not the world's most complicated thing, but if you're not initiated kind of into the Google Cloud ecosystem, it can be a little confusing at first because the Cloud Console you use to manage everything is the same Google Cloud Console that covers all of Google Cloud. So it can be a little overwhelming, it can be a little intimidating. So we always like to point our customers in the right direction and into those areas that they need to understand to get started using the service quickly and effectively. The next is just providing ongoing support, business reviews, and consultation. So whether you have a break-fix scenario or you just have kind of a random question about a product or service, what's the right thing to use where, or you're looking to incorporate new features and you're not sure if Google Maps can help with that or the right option for that, we're always happy to sit down and discuss with you those options. Optimization review. So that's a lot of what we kind of went through today. Going through, if you're already using the service, going through your billing, going through your use case, and making sure everything that matches up and there's no red flags or anything funny going on there. And if you're new to the service, making sure that you're optimized from the start and avoid some of those common pitfalls. Billing flexibility. So if you sign up directly with Google, really your only option is to register a credit card, and that credit card is charged automatically on a monthly basis. If you work with a partner like Dido, we can handle any sort of invoicing option that makes sense for you, really. Maybe some specialized payment terms, payment method, as well as annual prepaid options. We also provide regular product and service updates to our customers. If you are using multiple Google Enterprise products or services, again, we're a premier partner across all of those, so we can be kind of a single point of contact for your whole Google Enterprise experience, as well as leveraging our colleagues and understanding of the Google ecosystem to your benefit, and making sure your feedback is being provided directly to the product team and everything like that. And then also, finally, better pricing. So the way Google Maps is priced is on a volume tier basis. So basically, the more calls to an API you make in a month, at a certain point, you'll reach an additional volume tier, and the cost per request will drop to some extent. If you sign up directly with Google, by default, you only have access to those first two volume tiers. If you work with Dido, right out of the box, you'll have access to the full suite of volume tier pricing that's available. So if you do have a moderate to high amount of usage for a given API, you can see better pricing right out of the gate by working with Dido on that. So that kind of wraps things up. I just want to thank everyone again for joining the webinar today. We'd love to talk to you about how you're using Google Maps or looking to use Google Maps today. As well as, again, if you're using G Suite, Google Cloud, we'd love to talk to you about that as well. So again, thank you for joining the webinar today, and have a great rest of your day.